Quiet Riot. Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot Midnight Mass. I'm Alex.
And I'm Naomi. We just thought it might be useful at the end of what certainly feels like a very long campaign to gather our thoughts.
Yeah, and a very long day too. Tomorrow's regular episode will go out on the day of the actual election. So our battle as campaigners will be over and it will be your and our turn as voters.
We have two pretty extraordinary guests, I think you'll agree, Alex, and we plan to have fun, like soldiers back from the battle deserve to.
So for today, Naomi, I thought it would be useful to just take a step back from the day to day of the campaign, because it can be all consuming, and just take a little bit of a wider shot of the last 5 years, because it is really pretty extraordinary. A listener from the old days of the bunker sent me a clip recently of something I said about 4 years ago when everyone was absolutely certain that Johnson was in for not just a second term, they were talking about a third term. Starmer had just lost a by-election and there was even talk of him going.
Yeah.
And everything felt like it was basically the classic all is lost moment.
Yeah. Our side is very good at that. All is lost. We're all doomed.
Actually, I'll tell you what. I'll pop the clip in of what I said. As an actor and a Greek, I like my tragedy. I understand my dramatic arcs. So the point I was making on Friday was that this isn't a fight between Johnson and Starmer for now. It's a fight between Johnson and Johnson. I mean, between Johnson and himself, not the pharmaceutical company.
Not those guys.
He is, in my view, someone who regularly, when everything is going well, blows his life up. We all know people like him. The more confident and secure he feels, the more he will overreach. It is the fate of that kind of hubris and arrogance to end in failure. It might be next week or next month or in 2 years' time, but mark my words, the person who undoes Boris Johnson will be Boris Johnson. And in that sense, the more secure and invulnerable he feels, the more likely he is to misstep. So that was back in May 2021. And I wanted to drop this in here just to remind people a little bit, considering Boris's triumphant return to Sunak's campaign. I just wanted to remind people that at his peak, Boris Johnson had a 22-point lead over Labour. He was responsible for squandering those 22 points. By the time he was deposed, he was on aggregate around 10, 11 points behind. It's very easy to forget what happened then and to blame Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, and they're certainly to blame for a big portion of that. But the vast majority of that basically 40% turnaround is down to Boris Johnson. Quiet Riot. It's been a really packed few years. Brexit happened, COVID happened, Ukraine happened. We've had 3 changes of prime minister. And it was actually all those comments about Starmer wanting to carve out one evening a week with his family and all the Conservatives attacking him, that kind of made me review a little bit all the times they're guilty of dereliction of duty, all the times that Johnson went on holiday in the middle of a...
How many Cobra meetings did he miss during COVID?
5. He was on holiday at that time as well.
And Dominic Raab was on holiday when we withdrew from Afghanistan.
Yeah, as was Johnson. I'd forgotten that. Johnson was also on holiday when Kabul fell. Both Johnson and Raab.
And Raab was meant to be his deputy, right?
He was meant to be the deputy, and he was also, I think, defense secretary at the time, or maybe no, he was foreign
Secretary.
Commonwealth
Mm-hmm.
secretary. So the military side was down to Wallace, but the getting British people out of Kabul was very much Raab's brief.
Sure. I think it goes back even further, though.
Yeah.
If you want to chart the downfall and why Sunak hasn't been able to turn it round, look, there's one argument for saying it's all Nick Clegg's fault, and I'll be the first to make that. Maybe I won't now. One could go back further, ever since Heath took us into what was then the EEC in 1973, the Tory party has been anguished by how close or not the country should be tied to the continent. Yeah. And all of Heath's successors in 10 Downing Street, Margaret Thatcher, remember it was Geoffrey Howe, was pushed over the top because of Europe. Yeah. John Major narrowly survived Redwood's advances. Ken Clarke didn't become leader because of Europe, despite being the most popular Tory politician after 97. Then obviously David Cameron, obviously Theresa May, all swamped by Europe. But when we think very specifically about the last 14 years, you can't, I don't think, remove Sunak from austerity, the position Sunak finds himself in. Public spending fell from around 41% of GDP to 35%. Yeah. Deep cuts to social programs, infrastructure, international diplomacy. So yeah, they were doing good stuff on gay marriage. They were, showing a bit of ankle on climate action, but people felt poorer. They felt their public services beginning to creak. All the things they'd grown up used to were no longer there.
And what's interesting is that Johnson came in with a promise to be the opposite, right?
Very much.
So there was always an element of the culture war because he had placed himself in the Brexit camp for political reasons. And so his allies, his support within the party were the sort of mad right-wingers. But economically,
they were much more social democratic.
Yeah, he promised a spending government. He promised actually quite a big government, an interventionist government, a government with big projects.
Leveling up.
I mean, none of that may have happened, but the point is the ideological willingness, I guess, was declared, even if it wasn't sincerely meant.
The spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak.
Yes.
I mean, and he got Brexit done. So Britain did formally leave the EU in January 2020, but within 2 years, Johnson left as well, forced to resign over scandal, allegations about misleading Parliament, over lockdown parties, breaking his own rules, getting that fine. And of course, Sunak got the fine as well. My point being is that I just think that the rot began in 2010, but it just accelerated. And it got more and more compounded by each and every more ludicrous prime minister that followed, whether it was the bombastic Johnson, who never really wanted to do the job, he just wanted the title and the trappings of office, or whether it was then Truss with her completely disastrous budget, proposing tax cuts so extreme it triggered like weeks of panic in the bond markets and upbraiding from the IMF, normally reserved for like failed states. So while Sunak is deeply unpopular, he's not significantly more so than other G7 counterparts like Macron and Scholz.
Sure.
It's just they're not coming off the back of what he's come off of the last 14 years of failure.
I mean, look, one element that we have to acknowledge is that whoever was in charge when COVID and Ukraine and the cost of living crisis happened, whether left or right, will get a battering from voters. And you see that across various countries, regardless of whether it's a centrist government, a left government, a right government. Whoever is in charge for that period has had to face quite a bit of anger. But the thing that strikes me is that the two big events of this last premiership, which were Brexit and COVID, and to a certain extent Ukraine. But Ukraine is less of an issue because there was such agreement really between everyone. And so it's not a bone of contention. So Brexit and COVID have barely been mentioned this election, and yet it feels to me like they bubble under the surface of everything that's going on. Because when people talk about a loss of faith in politicians, a loss of trust
Mm-hmm.
in politics, a dropping of standards, a lack of ethics,
Yeah.
when Starmer goes on about putting government back in the service of people, those are the threads that he's referring to, right? The big broken promise is Brexit, which was going to do all these wonderful things, and loads of people voted for it, and no one will talk about it now.
Well, I will. I will.
But I can't believe that the disappointment with how it's turned out is not a factor.
Well, exactly, because it disappointed Remainers and Leavers. So if you were a Leaver for reasons around immigration, then ironically, Brexit didn't accomplish that goal.
It made it 10 times worse.
Net migration to the UK has increased since withdrawal. If you voted Leave because you believed in some kind of Singapore-on-Thames version of the UK, which I wholeheartedly reject, but some people wanted that, then, well, we've got the highest tax burden in living memory, and GDP is about 2 or 3% lower today compared to a scenario when we stayed in the EU, real income about 8 to 9% lower. And then if you voted Remain, of course it's a failure because you never wanted it. We have lost so much soft power. We've cut funding to the Foreign Office, foreign aid. One of the country's most significant soft power assets, the BBC, has had its funding cut. Defence spending has increased, yes, because of the invasion of Ukraine, but the size of the military has shrunk. And Sunak's last ditch proposal to mandate national service for 18-year-olds has not gone over well at all.
They've barely mentioned it recently, right?
I tell you who did mention it, Nick Clegg.
Ugh.
And I'm only half joking. Like, everyone knows that I don't rate him, but he was the first person of significance to socialize the concept of an in-out referendum as early as 2008. He called for it, an in-out referendum on the terms of our EU membership. Ed Davey was then kicked out of the chamber for arguing with the speaker over the speaker not calling a debate on an in-out referendum. So these were pro-Europeans helping to socialize the very concept of an in-out referendum on Europe. And then 2 years later, Cameron finds himself in a coalition with this man. Cameron himself, under huge pressure from the rise of UKIP, that Eurosceptic flank of the Tory party that is always there for as long as the party exists and we have a first past post system, it will do. And as they come to the end of their pretty unpopular coalition government, Cameron says, right, okay, if I win, if you give me an outright majority, I will call a referendum on Europe. And he was emboldened to do that because the leader of the most pro-European party, other than the Greens that had a seat in Parliament at that time, made it normalised. So if we really want to say, why is Sunak about to lose the election, not an insignificant amount of blame can actually be traced back to Nick Clegg.
You mentioned soft power.
I did.
And I wanted to say something because it barely gets a mention. And that's because it really isn't a thing for British people. But I cannot tell you what a point of contact it is for foreign people.
Yep.
And that's the British Council.
Yep.
The British Council had swinging cuts during austerity, which left it crippled anyway. I think it had to get rid of 40% of its staff. And then during COVID, it got no government support. And because its income had basically dried up, it has ended up closing 20 of its biggest global offices. I cannot tell you how important the British Council is for British soft power abroad. When I was growing up and learning English, when I had to go and get like my qualification, I went to the British Council. I had lessons there. I got the books that I needed to revise, and eventually I gave my exam there. It really is the first point of contact for foreigners with Britain in their country. Alliance Française, the Goethe Institute, the Institute of Cervantes, the Confucius Institute, China's, they're pumping money into it. They're opening more around the world while we're closing ours. But that's very much on a tangent.
We are no longer global Britain. You don't hear the phrase anymore. Like, people don't care about our opinion on things. There was a time where, if an ant died on Tiananmen Square, let alone students, everyone would look to see what the UK was going to say about it. That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Our revered world-class civil service isn't thought of in such high regard as it was when we funded Foreign Office properly and had our separate DFID department. And it's just very, very sad that there is such low ambition for our country. And I really, really look forward to not being embarrassed on the global stage by having proper leaders there.
I wonder if there's also an element that conservatism in general seems to me to be in trouble. We live in times that require actually quite a muscular state. They require quite a lot of international coordination because there are wars happening, there's climate change happening, and trade is global. And so, actually, you need quite a big state, quite an interventionist state, quite an internationally coordinated state. And conservatism is about stepping back and just letting the free market do its thing. And it seems to me that when it comes, for instance, to climate change, that model doesn't work. When it comes to a pandemic, that model doesn't work. And I was really struck that when the sort of energy bill crisis happened, when they went up by a lot, people turned to the government and there was an expectation of intervention.
You did furlough. You bailed out the bank.
Exactly.
Why aren't you doing
That has become the model. I think the government was almost, it ended up putting some schemes in place to avoid giving direct help, but I think we were very close to the government helping with mortgages that Liz Truss had basically cocked up. And so I wonder if the classic model of shrunken state, non-interventionist, laissez-faire, it simply doesn't apply anymore. And I think conservatives are really struggling to find a political ideology that captures who they are today. And the danger for me is that people like Nigel Farage or Marine Le Pen, they come along and they offer a model that says, we can give you the best bits
everything?
of liberalism and free market
Mhm.
economy, and we can also be the
Mhm.
paternalistic state takes care of everything for you. And we know that's nonsense, of course, but it is an attractive prospect. It fills a void. And so I think conservatives, it's not my tribe, but I think they have to find a solution to
I
this,
agree.
or they will be replaced.
And I'm sort of intrigued to see what they do. Look, listeners, don't repeat this, right? Tradecraft here. I have had quite a few, Conservatives and former Tories beg me to back some Tories in the getvoting.org recommendations so that there are some people left to help rebuild it. And I've said to them, "Well, you do it. Where are you? Where are the One Nation Tories putting their head over the parapet and actually doing something about this, rather than kind of sitting back and waiting, and being too fearful?" And I think that comes from the small c Conservative part of them.
Yeah.
They don't like to be revolutionary and radical and
Sunak does have a large part in it.
yeah.
I saw the other day, Morton Morland, who does the
Yeah,
cartoons for
amazing.
the Times.
Beautiful, beautiful.
He used to do some animated ones occasionally, and I saw an old animated one of his from the very start of Sunak's tenure, where someone said, I think it was Gove, and Gove was saying, but shouldn't we do something about X, Y, and Z? And Sunak replied, I am ultra focused in continuing to list the people's priorities. And I thought that's just
Perfect.
such an accurate reflection of his entire tenure. That's all he's done. The lack of substance is parallel to big, hefty editorial versus listicle, right? We needed an editorial and we got a fucking listicle. We got Sunak going, these are your priorities, and then listing them again and again and again. And having done that for 18 months pretty much, he got nowhere near improving any of them. Because if you think about it, really, we were talking about three things. 3 of the goals were economic.
Yep.
He was talking about improving the economy, getting a handle on immigration, and the NHS. At best, you might say that he steadied the economy,
No.
to be generous, but he hasn't improved it. The NHS is considerably worse, and immigration is considerably more out of control. I'm not going to pass a judgment on what people think should be the right number, but the point is that whatever you want from immigration, you want it to be a deliberate result of
Yeah,
policy. You
exactly.
don't want it to be a random thing that just happens to the country.
The only thing I would give him is Windsor Framework, and even that was, let's face it, a sticking plaster for something that should never have happened in the first place, which was the terrible deal Johnson got us. So yeah, I think you're being very generous, and I will go one extra and give him Windsor Framework.
I mean, Liz Truss was a blip, but she was an interesting blip in that she was the blip that the membership chose.
Yep.
And I think in that we see a really big part of the problem and a really big part of the problem that's ahead. Because if the Conservatives lose, I don't think there will be enough MPs, enough authority left in the parliamentary party for them to say we have to change the rules about who selects our leader. Their next leader will be selected by the same selectorate that looked at Truss and thought she was a good idea. And that worries me really, really deeply, right?
And you.
That's why
You.
I've joined because I'm like, I have to at least cancel out one idiot. And then we go back to Johnson. And I think Johnson's squandering of his authority, of the large majority that he had. Marina Hyde wrote a piece that I remember very well, in which she said that this was around COVID time, that once you notice that the tone of every speech he makes is basically, why me? Why did this have to happen? My glorious reign. And once you noticed it was like a tick, it was there in every single thing he said. If what you want to do is lead the country, then difficult times are when the country needs a good leader.
He didn't. He didn't want to do the job. He didn't want to lead. He wanted the trappings of office, the title, to be written up in the history books as a Prime Minister of the UK.
That means that going back to all of them, really, Cameron may be 10% less than the others. And even Theresa May, who has acquitted herself a little bit better since, I think it does apply to her. The last 5 prime ministers have lacked substance.
Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, and Sunak. So he's in your fifth.
Yeah, I think they all lack substance. I think none of them have the intellectual heft, the ideas, the steel.
Which is fine if you know you don't and you surround yourself by people who do. But what has crept into our politics is quashing talent. I don't want to have anyone that might threaten me too close. And I think that's been a stain on our democracy for the last 2 decades.
I try to think, which is why I gave Cameron a little bit of a break, because while I disagree with pretty much everything he did, with very few notable exceptions, at least he came into post with some ideas of what he wanted to do. And it seems to me that Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak came into the post with no idea of what they wanted to do. Liz Truss had someone else's ideas of what they wanted to do, but none of them really contained, in my view, the qualities that mean a person has a vision which makes them a leader. And so I look at Starmer and I worry. I do worry. I think he might be a very pleasant surprise, and I think just as likely he might be a bitter disappointment. I understand why he has offered nothing. A lot of people complain about the lack of detail, the lack of ambition, the lack of policy, where are the big ideas. At the same time, we have observed a Conservative Party that is absolutely willing to lie and twist everything and attack in a way that would have been considered unthinkable even 15 years ago. Absolutely
Even under Theresa May, it would have been
dishonorable, dishonest. And they are supported by a press that is also completely prepared to do the same. Look at the campaigns that the Daily Mail ran on Currygate and Angela Rayner's council flat. I mean, it was on the front page for days. Look at what the major press is doing on the very small, in my view, very discreet, very sensible policy of ceasing to give private schools that make a lot of money a tax break. It is in there every single day being hammered away. And so I look at that and I think, if I were advising Starmer, I would say nothing. Give no policy, give no detail, because if they can spin this shit out of nowhere, imagine what they will do if you give them detail of your policy to, let's say, break up the Home Office and make it into 2 different departments or whatever.
But let's bloody hope they've got some policy.
We'll find out very soon, I think. If the polls are to be believed,
we will.
We will find out very soon if this was a strategic silence or one that reflects an inner quiet.
Right, Alex, it's late. I think we should wrap it up.
Oh my God, it's so late. Why are we so workaholic? Because we love you, our listeners.
We do.
That's the truth. It feels incredibly collegiate and loving.
It has been very lovely.
Yeah, it really has.
We were really worried about doing this, and we ummed and ahed over it for a bloody long time. And so did Kenny, producer Kenny. Big shout out to him. Much love. But we were all bowled over by how supportive and wonderful and how big it's got so quickly. I mean, it's doing incredibly well. But you still got a duty to tell your friends about it, please listen.
Yeah, and I think what's going on with Farage here at the moment, Le Pen in France, I think that actually validates what we set out to do. The basic concept of it is that the big fight that is coming is not between left and right. It is between reason and unreason. It is between evidence and populism. If we're going to fight that fight, we can't be divided. We have to start building bridges and building relationships with sensible people on the left of Labour, sensible people on the, centre of the Conservative Party. We just have to build those alliances because the fight, it is coming.
Amen. Well, listeners, the full show is going to be out tomorrow morning, but you have got time to send questions to Quiet Riot Pod on social media or quietriotpod@gmail.com if you want to send us an email.
And vote. The enemy right now is lack of discipline, actually. It's thinking, I've had a long day, it doesn't matter, I'll go later, I'll go earlier, I forgot my passport.
I'll go when it stopped raining. Yeah. We've had 5 years of being completely kicked around, talked at, watching the whole country decline. Tomorrow, it's our turn to speak up.
It is the one day every 5 years when we all individually, politically, matter the same as everyone else. We get to choose the people who lead us probably for the next 5 years. Choose wisely.
Good night. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alexandria and Kenny Campbell. Music is by Mariana Sangita, artwork by Simona Canello. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot. That's better.